Will it make any difference which major political party gains control of Congress in next week's election? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. This is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled case for libertarianism. I'm joined as I am every week by most weeks, by my co-host Richard Ebeling. Richard, good to see you again for another round.
Great to be here back with you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, if you're new to FFF, come and visit us at fff.org. Subscribe to our FFF Daily, which is, I think, the best libertarian daily commentary page on the internet. We got a great monthly journal, Future of Freedom, which Richard and I contribute to every month. And we've got Libertarian Angle. We've got an online conference right now, one of the best conferences we ever put on, called End Inflation and the Fed. Every Monday night. It continues this coming Monday. Tune in. There's a Q&A session. It's pretty lively. So Richard, okay, we've got the big elections coming up on November 8th next week. Everybody's excited about it. Boy, the mainstream press is all gaga over the close races, and there's all this hullabaloo of which party's going to control Congress. And I mean, how many times do we have to go through this nonsense before people finally come to the realization that it really doesn't make any difference at all? I mean, what is the difference fundamentally between the two major political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans? I don't see any. Certainly not in terms of out of control spending and debt and inflation. When the Republicans controlled both houses of Congress and the presidency, what did they do with it? They didn't do anything. They just kept increasing the amount of the spending, the amount of the debt. Whenever the price ceiling came up, they caved into the pressure and permitted the federal government to borrow ever increasing amounts of money. So the Republicans take over. They're going to support the same type of thing they've been supporting for decades, which is the welfare state and the warfare state. Now, they may tinker at the edges. There may be difference between Democrats and Republicans over this particular program or that particular program. But in the overall scheme of things, this government is now over $31 trillion in debt. And that's in large part to both Democrats and Republicans, because they both support, in a fundamental sense, the welfare warfare state regulated society that is responsible for all this spending. And you can see it manifested in this so-called Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, how ridiculous is that? Where they're using that as the excuse to hire some tens of thousands of new IRS agents so they can plunder and loot the American people because of what the Federal Reserve is doing to finance this out-of-control spending and debt. Is that going to change if Republicans get into power in Congress? Of course not. They have as much interest in the IRS seizing ever-increasing amounts of money from people as the Democrats do, because they know it's needed. The Pentagon needs it for its ever-growing military-industrial intelligence complex and its interventionist antics around the world, including its nuclear antics there in Ukraine, which are getting us ever closer to all-out nuclear war. And they know that the welfare state needs it, the welfare recipients, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, education grants, public housing. They need to fund their beloved war on drugs that just keeps going on and on and on, regardless of the violence and the corruption and inherent in that program. They need to fund their war on immigrants. So my take on this is, well, go and vote for whichever one you want, Democrats or Republicans. It ain't going to make a dime's worth of difference. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I think that fundamentally the reason why the Republicans and the Democrats don't sound very different from each other, other than in certain forms of election time rhetoric, is that they represent and reflect, tragically, the general thinking of the American public. Now, some in the American public want to see these kind of programs increased or maintained. Republicans want to see those kind of programs are increased or retained. But the fact is that too many of our fellow citizens throughout the country uh, share and desire to see a continuation of the interventionist welfare state. Now, you can go back and say, well, why do they hold these views? Well, politicians have promised them something for nothing. The educational system, the mass media, all of which influences the cultural and the political and the ideological environment in which people hear about these things and think about them, and therefore take views, and that's reflected in the voting booth. But the fact is that both political parties are in a symbiotic relationship with each other and with the American public. Too many of our fellow citizens have come to fail to understand the founding principles upon which the country was founded, to appreciate the negative consequences of going down the type of policy roads that we have been, both domestically and in terms of foreign affairs, and are fearful of what would happen if any of these programs were cut or radically reduced, because they have been indoctrinated to believe that it would be the sky would fall and the welfare state and people would be dying in the street, and regulation and greedy monopoly businessmen will plunder the consumers and exploit the workers. America has to be policeman of the world, or the entire planet will implode into tyranny, disaster, and destruction. And this has resulted in a situation in which both parties present candidates that basically offer variations on the same interventionist welfare statist themes, because this is what the American people have come to believe is necessary, needed, and desirable. And so therefore, we will not see a change in the political direction, that is, who gets elected, what they stand for, what type of legislation they want to cut or abolish compared to increase and maintain, until there's a change in the climate of opinion. Um, the politics represents, the existing politics of today represents the ideas that are dominant in the society. I think I've mentioned before that there's a famous article by Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek that he wrote not too long after the end of the Second World War, called The Intellectuals and Socialism. And he said that if you want to change the politics of a country, you have to change the intellectual currents of the society. And that the politics of today represent the successful ideological and political ideas that have spread through the society several decades earlier. So that's what makes the efforts of an organization like the Future Freedom Foundation and related cousin organizations who share the same core libertarian, classical liberal free market values. They're so important because we cannot influence who gets elected next week and the policy agendas that Republicans and Democrats in general push from their shared collectivist and statist perspectives. But if there can be a change in the climate of ideas, and that can be working through the society, and then have that affect another generation looking down the road, then it may matter someday whether an election is held in terms of what the outcome will be and a freer society following that, if we can change the climate today to influence people's thinking in the voting booth several years down the road.
Yeah, you make some excellent points. I think you're saying that the politicians are just like a thermometer. I mean, they're just reflecting what public opinion is, and that if public opinion changes, that will be manifested in what public officials are promoting as a way to get elected. But let me draw a distinction between the point you're making about people believing in these welfare warfare state programs and the people that are actually on the dole. Now, there's obviously an overlap. There's a lot of people on the dole who believe that all this stuff is necessary. But then there's a lot of people who are not on the dole that believe it's all necessary. And the problem, I think, with people on the dole is that they, because they're on the dole, don't want to let go of this stuff, regardless of what they think. Even if they see that it's very damaging to the country, once you're on the dole, you're on the dole. It's like being on heroin, except for libertarians. I mean, libertarians take Social Security, and yet they still advance the case for abolishing Social Security. But except for that, I just cannot see any senior taking a position that his dole should be abolished. I just don't see it happening. And then the same with Medicare, that once you're on this dependency dole, it's like, well, we're going to abolish Medicare. Oh my gosh, Jacob, oh no, I would die in the streets if they abolish Medicare. And if you abolish Social Security, I'd be dying in the streets too. And so it's that mindset of dependency that this narcotic produces. And you go look at all the people, public housing, food stamps, Social Security, Medicare, education grants, FDIC. I mean, there are just countless people that are dependent on this dole, SBA loans and so forth. Very difficult to get them to say, yeah, okay, I'm ready to abolish this dole. And then look at the military-industrial complex. Not only are we talking about the massive number of people in the military itself, all the troops, the privates, the generals, the colonels, and so forth, they don't want to get their little gravy train reduced here. But then you've got the whole defense industry, and I put defense in quotation marks since obviously it doesn't involve defense at all. It involves foreign interventionism and empire. But you take that entire complex where they're dependent on this dole, more jet planes being produced and more Navy ships and so forth. And then on top of that, look at all of the military bases, not only here in the United States, but overseas too, where people are dependent on this dole and people in the communities. I mean, if you go to a community here in Virginia, let's say Norfolk, and say, we're going to dismantle the whole military base at Norfolk, man, everybody goes ballistic. Oh my gosh, Norfolk would fall into the ocean if that happened. Oh, we can't survive such a thing. And then, of course, there's all the people that are indirectly dependent on the military and industrial intelligence complex. The bars, the restaurants, the retail stores that build up around these giant military installations. So that's a problem that we libertarians have is can't we convince people to voluntarily, relinquish their dole in favor of a genuine free market society where nobody's on the dole, where everybody keeps 100% of what he earns, no more income tax. In other words, the founding economic system of this country. We sometimes forget that Americans throughout the 19th century lived without Social Security, Medicare, education grants, without a foreign empire, without foreign wars. And they also got to keep 100% of what they earned. There was no income tax. So I'm skeptical of success there, but I think we have an enormous possibility of achieving what we want to achieve by persuading people that are not on the dole to join up with us and get this thing abolished. That if they could be made to see that this whole system is so highly destructive, excuse me, and that really is causing America to fall from within. I mean, the threat is not Russia or China and all these other made-up enemies and adversaries and so forth. The threat to our country is right here from within, especially within the national security establishment, but also the whole welfare warfare state concept, the war on drugs, the war on immigrants. And I think that if enough people can be made to see that, I think they'll join up with us libertarians and say, hey, let's save this country. Let's get rid of this whole thing. And part of that process, Richard, is showing people that there's nothing to fear from freedom, that you could abolish Medicare and Social Security and education grants and food stamps today and public housing and the whole national security state and just have a limited government republic and a free market society based entirely on voluntary charity. And everything would not only be fine, it would be significantly better than what we have today. So that's my take on it.
Well, I think that your point is an important one to realize the hurdles that we have to face. I've seen estimates, maybe some of the viewers and listeners have too, that if you count all forms of government programs from which people are benefiting, either directly or indirectly, directly, I mean someone who gets their Social Security check or has Medicare pay for their medical expenses when they go see a doctor, et cetera. Or if you count the the defense industry related company, the company that makes the planes, the jets, the missiles, but who have those surrounding communities that are dependent upon the government money that then flows into the community in which they have their plant and factory located. That somewhere around 47% of the entire US population uh, has a net benefit from these types of things. At least, so half of the population is on some immediate or very close indirect dole. And to break that, spiders web of special interest groups, who the fact is in the short run, yes, in the long run, it is absolutely true. If the economy was freed up, the government got out of the way, taxes were cut, regulations that impede competitiveness were abolished. Looking down the road, 5 years, 10 years, certainly the longer run of the 20 years, the degree of vibrant, innovative prosperity and opportunity and variety that we would have would be much greater than we even have today or could imagine looking ahead. But in the short run, suddenly people's invested capital loses a lot of its value or maybe goes to zero. People who have invested in human labor skills to work in a particular industry now have to change occupation. People who have invested in one of those orbit companies or businesses that feed off this money in the local community see customers disappear, revenues fall, having to maybe either reduce or shut down their businesses and find another line of entrepreneurial or salaried work. All of those short run adjustments and rebalancings are what people are afraid of and cannot imagine of how they would handle it. And the friends of freedom have to accept in working out a strategy to persuade their neighbors, have to accept the fact that there would be in the short run a lot of disruption to people's lives if all of this money goes away. One reflection of this, to go back to the Republicans versus the Democrats, and I believe I've mentioned this before in one of our discussions, Jacob, is that I occasionally go to a once a month Republican luncheon group here in the Charleston area. And so, around election times like this, Republican candidates get up to talk to the crowd, each trying to say, please support me. But you have them doing Q&A. And I have more than once gotten up and asked them. And remember, these are Republicans who will say government is too big, too intrusive, too heavy-handed. People are not being given the free enterprise opportunities that they should in a free society. All right, that's their rhetoric. And then I get up and I say, well, I would like to ask each of you just very briefly for maybe a minute or two to explain, given that you say that government is spending too much and taxing too much, could you please enumerate just one or two programs at the state or local level that you think could either be radically reduced or even abolished? Because from our limited government perspective, government shouldn't be doing those things at any level of government. And suddenly there is dead silence in the room. Or as one of my friends said after I did this, you could hear the crickets chirp. Okay. I mean, dead silence. So because once you want them to put it in the concrete, actual proposing the abolition or radical reduction of some government program or regulatory setup, because you see that suddenly they have to tell potential voters, I'm taking away your goodies. I'm taking away your special little anti-competitive protection. And they don't want to have to do that because they're more concerned with offering things to get votes than being the guy who takes away the pot of candy.
Yeah, I remember there was a great supporter of the libertarian movement named Bernie Baltic, who lived in Ohio, and he passed away several years ago. But one of the best supporters. In fact, I think he was I know he was our very first donor to FFF in 1989, 1990, and Bernie had a variation of what you're talking about. That whenever any politician, Republican or Democrat, would come and ask him for money, he would say, please outline your principles for me. And they would look at him blankly. Or he'd write them, in response to one of their fundraising letters saying, before I decide whether to fund your campaign or not, please send me your statement of principles. And he says, inevitably, they all just walked away. They were dumbfounded. They didn't know what that meant. And that's really what's happened. You've got politicians that just have these ad hoc opinions and positions and beliefs that really there's no consistency. There's no principle to them. Certainly, there's no libertarian principle to them. Now, you raise an interesting point about these people that are dependent on the dole, and that there will be adjustments in the sense that some of them may lose their money. Let's say a bar has been set up next to a big military base. If we close the military base, the bar owner, he goes out of business. But Richard, that doesn't bother me in the sense that, well, he ought to count himself lucky to have been able to live off the dole for this long. In other words, here's the way I analogize it. Well, let's say that you've got your private office, you're running a business, and you learn that your assistant has been embezzling money from you for 20 years, and that he or she is just dependent on this money. They have kids in college. They have house payments that they just use this money. Let's say it's $20,000 a month that they embezzle from you. So you say, well, I'm going to terminate this. And so the assistant says, wait a minute, this is a very radical adjustment. We're dependent on this money. Can you please phase it out over a period of time? Well, that's the way I see the bar owner over here, is that he's been living off this tax revenue, this largesse, which has been very destructive in terms of higher standards of living in society. For example, they tax productive citizens to give the money to the military, which then spends it in these bars, when if they didn't do that at all, everybody would be able to keep that money and it would go into productive activity rather than in this military-induced bar. Another example that I thought about you were talking about was the National Industrial Recovery Act in Franklin Roosevelt's era. Now, of course, this was when the big revolutionary transformation took place in favor of a welfare state. It was during Roosevelt's term and New Deal. And ironically, what I think most Americans, it's safe to say, don't even realize to this day is it was the Federal Reserve that brought the Great Depression into existence. We were all taught in public schools and in our colleges and universities, especially the state-supported ones, that this was a failure of America's free enterprise system. That's what Roosevelt was expounding. It was all a lie. It was the Federal Reserve, through its monetary antics, contracting, expanding, and so forth, that brought on the stock market crash in '29 that then led to the Great Depression. And to meet this depression, Roosevelt enacts this, what can only be called a fascist program, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA. I mean, it really did resemble Mussolini's program in fascist Italy. And they had the Blue Eagle, as you know, Richard, that was the motto. And businesses were exhorted to become part of the National Recovery Administration's efforts to bring prosperity to America. And it was fascist in the sense that they were putting all American industries, or many American industries, into cartels, and then letting them set their own prices and work conditions and so forth. It was just straight out of the fascist playbook. So people were talking about the horrible effect it was having on the American economy. But the argument was, well, we can't just get rid of it overnight. There'll be chaos. There's too many people dependent on it. Think of the adjustments that'll have to take place. We'll have to phase it out over a period of time. And then one day, the Supreme Court announced that this whole program was unconstitutional. And there was no grace period. The Supreme Court didn't say, well, we know this is going to be difficult, so our judgment will not become final for 6 months. On the day they came out and announced their ruling, that law was over, done. And there was an immediate increase in prosperity. Now, undoubtedly, there were people that were adversely affected. There's no doubt about it. But my argument is that, well, they shouldn't have been dependent on that in the first place. They ought to count themselves lucky that they were dependent for as long as they were.
Well, the difficulty from the average person's point of view, I think, is that, let's suppose this fellow owns the bar. And I suppose in some abstract way, you could persuade him that his customers are only his customers in terms of having dollars to spend in his establishment, because they receive their pay as a member of the armed forces um, on that neighboring base. Um, Other military facilities are located in the area that from which his clientele comes. But you see, from him, he doesn't see that. He sees concrete dollars spent in his bar when the beer or the whiskey is purchased and the dollar is put down on the counter. The chain of reasoning that shows that if it wasn't for the fact that the government taxed this money for inappropriate purposes, those dollars wouldn't have been available to begin with, spent in this way, and that therefore he might never have been induced or seen an opportunity to open his bar to serve that clientele at that neighboring military base. For him, he just sees the revenues go down, his customers disappear, and now he has debts that he has accumulated. He has contracts with his suppliers that he has to get out of. He might very well have to shut his whole establishment down and go into a different kind of a line of business that he would find less attractive, from being a self-employed small businessman having to go into a hired salaried position working for someone else. That's what they see in front of them. That doesn't mean that the change is not necessary or desirable, but if one is going to try to move the argument forward, one has to understand the psychological barriers that we as friends of freedom must try to help others to overcome if we're going to persuade them to hold our point of view.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh by saying I don't care. I mean, I do care. I mean, if the guy's going bankrupt and he can't feed his family and so forth, I certainly would care about that. But my point is that, for one thing, I don't think you're ever going to convince him of the merits of what we're talking about in terms of this different paradigm, a paradigm based on freedom and limited government. He's dependent on this. He's got notes at the bank. He's not about to. He's going to rationalize whatever he needs to rationalize as to why this system's necessary. What I'm suggesting is that those that we have a chance of reaching that are willing to join the libertarian movement and come with us with this different paradigm. And obviously, it's an attractive paradigm. It's not just you and me that believe in this. There's a lot of other libertarians that have discovered this philosophy and say this is what we want. We can't let the possibility that this guy's going to hurt, stop us from moving toward achieving that free society. Let's put it like this. If we have a choice between freedom and keeping this guy's bar going and in a non-free society, I say you got to go with freedom and just have faith in the fact that this guy's going to figure out how to move his bar somewhere else, or if he does have to get a job somewhere else, well, that's what happens to a lot of people in life. Even in a free market economy, as you know, there's businesses that are going under all the time under what is called creative destructionism of the free market. And we can feel sorry for people when their businesses are going under because of shift in consumer tastes or whatever. But I don't think that should dissuade us from continuing to press forward and get this whole thing dismantled.
Well, I think we have to think strategically, Jacob, in that we somehow get voters in South Carolina to vote to close military bases in California, and we have Californians voting just to close military bases in South Carolina. So it never seems to be their ox that's being gored directly.
No. Now, let me just interrupt you because that's a fascinating point, Richard. That's a great point. Because if you can get people to target, let's say, one sector of welfare recipients, those welfare recipients that are now no longer on the dole have the incentive to join up with us to target another group. And it starts growing that way. So I think your point's very well taken.
The other thing that has to be kept in mind is that one of the most successful property tax laws passed in California was called Prop 13. This was back in the 1970s. And what it was to lower property taxes statewide and to then make it very difficult to increase property taxes. And it was argued that, oh, you'll never get this through because, the local teachers unions, they live off these local property taxes, because of the revenues for the schools and stuff. but oh, I'm forgetting the fellow's name. I'm sorry, I can't remember.
Jarvis. Dr.
Jarvis, thank
Jarvis.
you. Now, he even appeared in a cameo in the comedy movie Airplane. But anyway, which some people are old enough to remember. But anyway, Howard Jarvis. But he saw that there was a way to create a wider special interest group. And that is, there were more property owners who would see a noticeable cut in their property taxes than there were people who were members of the teachers union, even if many of those teachers union members were themselves homeowners. And he was able to form a coalition that got Prop 13 through very successfully and kept property taxes down in California for a very long time.
That's a great example. The same sort of thing happened in Colorado. That there they enacted a constitutional amendment, which had been on the ballot, I think, 2 or 3 different times and it failed, but this time it passed, that said that no institution, no governmental institution in the state at any level, local, state, whatever, county, that could raise taxes without first going to the voters and getting approval. Well, that put a clamp down on a lot of government activity and taxation. They targeted this guy with a vengeance, man. They went after him. They called him a tax terrorist or something like that. So it's a good thought where you start thinking in terms of a global initiative rather than just individual tax laws or something like that.
Yeah, the other thing is that, and this was a proposal made by John Stuart Mill, I've written about this as well, in his book from 1859, Reflections on Representative Government. He has a chapter and he talks about the franchise, the voting franchise. And his proposal was that all those who receive any, what today we would call welfare payment, would be ineligible to vote for the period of time that they were on the dole. And in fact, for 5 years following that as well. Because as he's put it, it's a conflict of interest for the person living off other people's money to get to vote to pickpocket them.
Well, that would be an interesting proposal. Of course, my hunch is that most people would say, I don't care about voting. I just want my dole. Especially since one vote, as you know, Richard, doesn't hardly ever affect the outcome of an election anyway.
That's true, which is why, as I recently expressed it to you, I wish every other person in America would take that view. So I was the only one left voting, and then my vote really would count.
Yeah, no, that reminds me of that the variation of that Walter Williams used to talk about, where his next door neighbor says, Professor Williams, who are you voting for? And he says, I don't vote. And she says, that's terrible. How do you expect to change the direction of America or influence things? And he says, oh, well, I got a column, syndicated column. I teach students. I substitute host for Rush Limbaugh. And she says, well, that's just terrible. What if everyone took your position and didn't vote? And William says, well, then I'd vote.
Exactly.
All right. On that note, Richard, we'll wrap things up. Happy voting next Tuesday. And I look forward to talking to you next week. And thank you all for tuning in. And thanks for your support of FFF.
Till next time.